The first time I realized I wasn't welcome at my own son's funeral was when my phone stopped ringing. That silence, heavy and deliberate, was louder than any scream. It pressed against my ears as I stood in my kitchen, the kettle shrieking on the stove, the smell of burnt metal rising into the air because I'd forgotten I'd even put it on. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't turn the knob. I just stood there, staring at the steam crawling up the wall like a ghost, thinking, something is wrong. Something is very wrong. My son, Daniel, had been pronounced dead 3 hours earlier. A heart attack, they said. Sudden, no warning, no goodbye. And yet, somehow, in all that chaos, in all that unbearable grief, no one had told me when or where they were laying my child to rest. I found out by accident. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Klein, who mentioned it first. She'd come over with a casserole I hadn't touched, her eyes red, her hands fidgeting with the foil. She hesitated in my doorway, then said quietly, "I heard the service is tomorrow morning at Grace Hill." I remember looking at her like she'd spoken another language. "Service?" I asked. My voice sounded far away, like it didn't belong to me. She nodded slowly. "Yes, Daniel's funeral. I assumed you knew." I didn't. And when I finally called my daughter-in-law, the woman my son married, the woman who now carried his last name, she answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was calm, too calm. "I don't think it's appropriate for you to attend," she said, just like that, no pause, no apology. "I'm sorry?" I whispered. "This is a private service," she continued, her words clipped, rehearsed. "Daniel wouldn't have wanted tension." That was the moment something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a slow, quiet way, like ice splitting beneath your feet while you're still standing on it. Because whatever else she believed about me, whatever story she had told herself or others, she did not get to erase me from my son's life or his death. Before all of this, my life had been simple, not easy, but honest. I lived alone in the small blue house Daniel grew up in, the one with the creaky third stair and the maple tree out front that dropped leaves like pennies every autumn. My mornings started early. I made my coffee strong with a splash of milk and sat at the same spot by the window where I could watch the street wake up. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, the world continuing even when mine felt like it had slowed down. Daniel called me every Sunday. Not long calls, he was never one for long conversations, but steady ones, predictable. "Just checking in, Mom," he'd say, and I'd hear traffic in the background or the hum of his car. Sometimes I'd hear her too, his wife, Lena, moving around the kitchen, opening cabinets, never quite speaking into the phone. They'd been married 7 years, no children. When he first told me about her, his voice had that careful excitement people get when they're afraid of being judged. "She's strong," he'd said, "independent. You'll like her." I wanted to. God knows I tried. But Lena had always kept a distance that felt intentional. She smiled without warmth, hugged without leaning in. When we sat at the same table, she'd angle her body away, her foot tapping beneath the chair like she was counting the minutes until she could leave. I told myself it was just personality or nerves, or maybe I reminded her too much of the life Daniel had before her. I stayed polite, careful, quiet. I was not the kind of mother who meddled. I didn't show up unannounced or ask invasive questions. I sent birthday cards on time. I learned Lena's coffee order. I complimented her cooking even when it was overcooked or bland. I wanted peace. And for the most part, we had it, or at least the appearance of it. The last time I saw my son alive was 3 weeks before he died. They'd come over for dinner on a Thursday evening. I remember because it had rained all afternoon and the house smelled of damp wool and tomato sauce. My son kissed my cheek when he walked in like he always did, but his hug lingered longer than usual. "You okay?" I asked him softly, pulling back to look at his face. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired, work stuff." Lena barely met my gaze. She spent most of the evening on her phone, thumbs moving quickly, the blue glow lighting her face. When I offered dessert, she said she wasn't feeling well. Daniel ate in silence, his fork scraping the plate in a way that made my skin prickle. When he stood to leave, he squeezed my shoulder. "I'll call you this weekend," he said. He didn't. I told myself not to worry. Mothers are good at lying to themselves. We learn early that panic doesn't change outcomes, that loving someone means trusting them to live their own life. I folded my concern into neat corners and tucked it away. Until the hospital call came at 4:17 a.m., until a stranger's voice told me my only child was gone. And now I was being told I didn't belong at her funeral. I sat down at my kitchen table after that call with Lena, my phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the maple tree swayed gently, leaves tapping against the window like they were trying to get my attention. I thought of Daniel as a boy, standing in that same kitchen, tugging on my sleeve, asking if his dad would ever come back. I thought of his graduation, his wedding day, how he'd looked at Lena with something between hope and caution. And I thought, what aren't they telling me? Because no woman wakes up one day and decides to ban a mother from her son's funeral without a reason. The question was, whose reason was it really? And how far back did it go? I folded my hands together on the table and took a breath that felt like it scraped my lungs on the way in. Whatever else she believed about me, whatever story she had told herself or others, she did not get to erase me from my son's life or his death. After Lena hung up on me, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The kettle had gone cold. The steam had vanished, leaving only a thin film of moisture on the wall that slowly slid downward, like a tear that didn't know where to go. Grief does strange things to time. Minutes stretch into hours. Thoughts circle back on themselves like they're looking for an exit that isn't there. I kept replaying her words, "not appropriate," as if they were a puzzle I could solve if I stared at them long enough. What kind of mother is inappropriate at her son's funeral? I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my call history. Daniel's name sat there, quiet and final. No more outgoing calls, no more incoming ones, just a record of everything that would never happen again. I needed to understand how we got here. Before Lena came into his life, it had always been just the two of us. Daniel's father left when Daniel was 6, packed his clothes into black trash bags, and said he needed space, a word my son would spend years trying to understand. I worked double shifts at the pharmacy, learned how to fix leaky faucets from YouTube videos, and sat through school plays in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else. Daniel grew up gentle, observant, the kind of boy who noticed when someone was uncomfortable and adjusted himself accordingly. He hated conflict, hated raised voices. Even as a child, he'd stand between arguing kids on the playground and ask them to stop like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. That part of him never changed. When he met Lena, I sensed immediately that she was different from the women he'd dated before. She was sharp where he was soft, decisive where he hesitated. She spoke with confidence and certainty, the kind that made people listen. I admired that about her, at first, but there were moments, small ones, that left me uneasy. The first time Daniel canceled a Sunday call, Lena texted instead, "He's busy. I'll let him know you called." That became a pattern. Then holidays started changing too. We're doing our own thing this year. Traveling is too stressful. Daniel needs rest. Each explanation was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a wall I hadn't noticed being built until I was standing outside it. I blamed myself. I told myself this was what letting go looked like. The last argument I ever had with my son happened 6 months before he died. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of quiet disagreement that leaves more damage behind because nothing is ever fully said. He'd called me late one evening, his voice low. "Mom," he said, "Lena feels like you don't respect our boundaries." I gripped the phone tighter. "What boundaries, Daniel?" He hesitated. I could hear him exhale. "She thinks you ask too many questions, that you undermine her." I laughed then, a soft, disbelieving sound. "I barely see you anymore." "That's not the point," he said, gently but firmly. "I need you to try harder, for me." Try harder. The words stung because I'd spent my whole life trying. I swallowed my pride and apologized anyway, told him I loved him, told him I'd do better. Lena didn't speak to me for months after that. So when Daniel died, I expected distance, coldness even, but not erasure. The morning after I learned about the funeral, I drove to the church anyway. I told myself I just needed to see the place, to stand in the building where they planned to say goodbye to my son, even if I wasn't allowed inside. Grace Hill was a modest stone church on the edge of town, surrounded by tall pines that whispered when the wind moved through them. There were cars in the parking lot already, black sedans, familiar faces. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I didn't get out. Instead, I watched as people I'd known for years walked through the front doors, neighbors, co-workers, distant relatives, people who knew my son as my son, and not one of them looked for me. I turned the car around before anyone could notice me sitting there. Back home, I finally broke down. The kind of crying that leaves your throat sore and your eyes swollen, the kind where your body folds in on itself because it doesn't know how else to carry the weight. I pressed my face into Daniel's old sweatshirt, one I still kept in the hall closet, and breathed in the faint scent of laundry detergent and something unmistakably him. When the tears finally slowed, something else took their place. Clarity. Lena hadn't just banned me out of grief. This was deliberate, planned, and if she thought I would quietly disappear, she didn't know me at all. I called Daniel's best friend, Marcus, the one who'd stood beside him at the wedding. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Hayes?" His voice cracked when he said my name. "I'm so sorry. I need you to tell me the truth. Why am I not welcome at my son's funeral?" There was a pause. A long one. "I thought you chose not to come," he admitted. My stomach dropped. "Why would you think that?" "He said Lena said you didn't want to cause a scene, that you and Daniel were estranged." Estranged. The word landed like a slap. I thanked him and hung up before he could hear the anger creeping into my voice. So that was it. She hadn't just excluded me, she'd rewritten the story. Painted me as the difficult mother, the unstable presence, the woman whose absence was her own choice. I stood up from the couch and walked into Daniel's room. The bed was still made the way I'd left it years ago. On his dresser sat a framed photo of the two of us at the beach, sunburned and laughing. I picked it up and held it close. "No," I whispered to the empty room, "you don't get to take this from me too." If Lena wanted to control the narrative, she'd chosen the wrong woman to silence, because I was done staying quiet. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow, uneven circles, its soft clicking marking the hours as they passed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face, older, younger, smiling, worried, layered over itself like memories fighting for space. Estranged. The word wouldn't leave me alone. By morning, exhaustion had sharpened into something else entirely: determination. I made myself toast I didn't taste and coffee I barely touched, then sat down with my phone and a notebook. If Lena had decided to erase me from my son's story, I needed to understand when it started and why. The first thing I did was call the funeral home. I kept my voice steady, calm, polite. "Hello, I'm Daniel Hayes's mother," I said. "I'm calling to ask about the service arrangements." There was a pause on the other end, papers rustling. "I'm sorry," the woman said carefully. "The service is private, only those approved by the next of kin." "I am next of kin," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "I understand," she said, lowering her voice, "but we've been instructed otherwise." I hung up without arguing. No use pushing where doors were clearly locked. Instead, I began making quiet calls, not confrontational ones, curious ones. Daniel's cousin first, then an old coworker, then a neighbor who'd watched him grow up. Each conversation followed the same pattern: sympathy, confusion, hesitation, and then little cracks. "She said you weren't taking it well," one woman admitted. "She told us you asked not to be involved," said another. "Lena said Daniel didn't want you there," a third whispered. Each explanation contradicted the last. By midday, my grief had been joined by something colder, a creeping suspicion that this wasn't about protecting Daniel's memory at all. It was about control. That afternoon, Marcus came over. He stood awkwardly in my living room, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, eyes darting to the family photos on the wall. I offered him tea. He declined. "I didn't know," he said finally, "about the funeral, about what she told people." "I know," I replied, and I meant it. "Tell me something, Marcus. Was Daniel unhappy?" He swallowed, looked down. "He was tired, stressed. He didn't talk much about his marriage, but it wasn't easy." "Did he ever mention me?" I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation said more than words. "He said you were worried about him," he admitted, "that you asked questions Lena didn't like." My hands curled into fists in my lap. "Did he say he wanted me out of his life?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "Never." That night, I went through Daniel's old emails. I hadn't touched his computer since he moved out, but it was still there, tucked beneath his desk like a time capsule. When I powered it on, the familiar hum filled the room. His login password was the same one he'd used for college. I wasn't snooping, not really. I was searching for my son. There were drafts of unfinished emails, work documents, travel confirmations. And then I found a folder labeled Personal. Inside were messages he'd written to himself, notes, unsaved letters. One caught my eye. "Mom deserves better than this." I read it 3 times, my chest tightening. The note was dated 4 months before his death. Another followed. "I hate choosing sides. I just want peace." I sat back in the chair, tears blurring the screen. Daniel had been trapped between us, not because I demanded it, but because someone had framed love as a competition. The next morning, I went to the bank. Daniel had named me as a secondary contact years ago, back when he'd first opened his account. After his marriage, things had changed. I didn't expect access, but I needed confirmation. The teller's smile faded when she pulled up his file. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "All account permissions were updated last year. Only his wife is listed." I nodded, thanked her, walked out. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and breathed slowly until the world stopped spinning. Lena had tightened her grip long before the funeral. The final clue came from an unexpected place: Daniel's phone. I hadn't thought to ask for it. It hadn't even crossed my mind. But that afternoon, Lena's sister showed up at my door. Her eyes were red, her posture tense. "I shouldn't be here," she said, "but this doesn't feel right." She held out a small paper bag. Inside was Daniel's phone. "She was going to wipe it," her sister whispered. "I took it before she could." My hands shook as I accepted it. "What did she say about me?" I asked softly. Her sister looked away. "That you were controlling, that you made his life harder, that keeping you away was what he would have wanted." The phone felt heavy in my palm. I thanked her and closed the door, my heart pounding. If Lena had nothing to hide, she wouldn't be rewriting the past or erasing evidence. I sat down at the table, powered on the phone, and braced myself, because whatever was inside, I knew it would change everything. Daniel's phone lit up my kitchen like a small, unforgiving sun. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I just stared at the screen, at the faint smudge near the corner where his thumb must have rested 1,000 times. This was the last thing he held, the last place his thoughts lived. I whispered his name before I even realized I was doing it. "I'm here," I said softly, as if he could hear me now. "I'm listening." The phone unlocked easily. His passcode was still the same, my birthday. That detail alone sent a sharp ache through my chest. If he had truly wanted me erased, he would have changed it. I started with the messages. At first, there was nothing unusual. Group chats, work threads, short replies from Lena, efficient, clipped, transactional. But as I scrolled further back, patterns began to emerge. Messages deleted on her side, long gaps in conversation, Daniel asking questions that went unanswered. Then I found a thread labeled simply, "Mom." My breath caught. The last message he'd sent me, "I'll call you this weekend," sat there unanswered, but beneath it were messages I had never seen. I tried calling. "Lena said you were busy. She says you don't want to talk to me anymore. Did I do something wrong?" My hands flew to my mouth. He thought I had abandoned him. The realization hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and let out a sound that came from somewhere deep and animal inside me. All those missed calls, all that silence, it hadn't been distance, it had been interception. I kept reading. There were emails, too, drafts he never sent, apologies for things I hadn't accused him of, confessions of stress, of feeling torn, of being the problem no matter what he chose. One message sent to Lena but never answered made my stomach turn. "I don't want to choose between my wife and my mother. Please stop asking me to." I closed my eyes. That was the betrayal. Not just the funeral, not just the lies, but the quiet manipulation that had slowly isolated my son until he believed he was alone. I kept reading. There were voice memos, too. My finger hovered over the first one, dated 2 weeks before his death. My heart hammered as I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, soft, tired, unmistakably him. "Dad, if you ever hear this, I just want you to know I never stopped loving you. I didn't know how to fix things. I thought maybe time would calm everything down." The recording ended abruptly. I sobbed then, not neatly, not quietly. I pressed my forehead to the table and cried for the son who had carried guilt that wasn't his to bear. By the time I reached the final message, my grief had transformed into something else, something steadier, sharper, resolute. The truth didn't belong buried in a phone. It didn't belong hidden behind a private funeral and a rewritten story. It belonged in the light. I didn't confront Lena right away. That surprised even me. Instead, I printed copies of the messages, saved the voice recordings, backed everything up twice. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're handling something fragile and sacred. Then I made a call to the pastor at Grace Hill. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I have evidence that my son did not wish me excluded from his funeral." There was silence on the other end. "Could you come in?" he asked. When I arrived, Lena was already there. She sat stiffly in the church office, hands folded in her lap, dressed in black so severe it looked almost theatrical. She didn't look at me when I walked in. The pastor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hayes has brought some concerns to my attention." Lena's jaw tightened. "This is unnecessary." I met her gaze for the first time in days. So was lying about my relationship with my son. Her eyes flashed. "You don't understand what Daniel wanted." I placed my phone on the desk between us. "I do," I said quietly, "because he told me, just not out loud." Her composure cracked then, just slightly. "Enough. You always made him feel guilty. You never let him grow up." The words hurt. Of course they did, but they didn't stop me. I let him go every day. What I didn't do was disappear. The pastor listened as I played the recording, as I showed him the messages, as the story Lena had carefully constructed began to unravel thread by thread. When it was over, the room felt heavier. "I think," the pastor said slowly, "Daniel would have wanted his mother present." Lena stood abruptly. "You're taking her side." "No," he said gently, "I'm honoring the truth." She left without another word. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was the funeral home. "The service will be open to immediate family," the woman said. "We apologize for the confusion." Confusion. I almost laughed. The day of the funeral, I wore a navy dress Daniel told me made me look strong. I pinned a small silver brooch to my collar, one he'd given me for my birthday years ago. When I walked into Grace Hill, heads turned. Some faces registered surprise, others relief. Lena sat in the front row, rigid, her gaze fixed straight ahead. I took my seat behind her, and when the pastor invited family to speak, I stood. My legs trembled, but my voice didn't. "I am Daniel's mother, and I am proud of the man he was." I didn't accuse, I didn't shout. I told the truth, and that was enough. Standing at the podium, I could feel the weight of every eye in the room. The church smelled faintly of old wood and lilies. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled. I didn't look at Lena. I didn't need to. My focus was on the closed casket in front of me, the quiet, final shape of my son's body, and the life he had lived beyond the stories being whispered about him. "Daniel was gentle," I began. "Not weak, gentle by choice." I spoke about his kindness, his patience, how he used to bring me soup when I was sick and insist on washing the dishes afterward, even when he'd worked a 12-hour shift. I spoke about the way he avoided conflict, how he believed peace was something you built, not demanded. What I didn't do was mention betrayal. But people heard it anyway. After the service, I stayed. That was my first act of quiet rebellion, refusing to vanish the moment my role was finished. I accepted condolences, hugged people who smelled of perfume and grief, answered questions with calm honesty. "Yes, I'm his mother." "No, we weren't estranged. He loved deeply." Lena avoided me at first, drifting from one group to another like smoke, but eventually there was nowhere left to hide. She approached me near the exit, her voice low. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," I replied.
Her eyes were red now, not the tidy kind of crying, but the kind that blurs edges and cracks defenses. "You embarrassed me." I studied her face, finally allowing myself to see her fully, not as an enemy, but as a woman who had loved my son in a way that demanded too much ownership. "I didn't embarrass you," I said gently. "The truth did." For a moment, I thought she might say more, apologize, explain. That instead, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. Not dramatically, not with gossip-hungry urgency, just enough. People reached out, quiet messages, coffee invitations, handwritten notes. A few apologized for believing what they'd been told. Others admitted they'd always felt something was off but didn't know how to question it. Lena withdrew. She stopped answering calls, canceled gatherings. When Daniel's co-workers asked to visit, she declined. Grief, she said, privacy. But I knew better now. Control thrives in silence, and silence had been broken. One afternoon, about a month after the funeral, I received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single page folded carefully. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," it read. "I just wanted him to choose me." I sat at the table and read it 3 times. There was no signature. I didn't reply, because some confessions aren't asking for forgiveness, they're asking to be witnessed. I kept Daniel's phone locked away after that, not as evidence anymore, but as memory. I listened to his voice when the house felt too quiet, read his words when doubt crept in. And slowly, painfully, something shifted. I stopped asking why. I started asking what now. I joined a grief support group at the community center, sat in a circle of folding chairs and listened to strangers speak truths I'd been afraid to name, learned that anger and love can exist in the same breath. I planted a small garden under the maple tree out front, tomatoes, basil, mint, things Daniel used to tease me about killing. When the first green shoots pushed through the soil, I cried again. But this time it felt like release. Lena and I never spoke after that day at the church. I heard through others that she moved away, sold the house, started over somewhere no one knew the story. I don't wish her harm, but I don't protect her version of events either, because the lesson Daniel left me, unintentionally, painfully, was that love doesn't require erasure, it doesn't demand isolation, and it never asks you to disappear to make room for someone else. Some evenings I sit on the porch as the sun sets, the air cooling just enough to make me pull a sweater around my shoulders. I imagine Daniel sitting beside me, feet on the railing, pointing out shapes in the clouds like he did when he was small. I tell him things I didn't get to say. "I stayed," I whisper. "I told the truth." And in the quiet that follows, I feel something like peace. Grief doesn't leave all at once. It loosens its grip slowly in ways you don't always notice until one day you realize you've gone an hour without thinking about what you lost, and instead you're thinking about what you still have. For me, that realization came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was standing in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie, the radio humming softly in the background. My hands moved without shaking. The house didn't feel hollow, just quiet. And quiet, I was learning, didn't always mean lonely. After Daniel's funeral, people assumed I would retreat, that I would shrink into myself, let the story end where the loss did. But something inside me refused to fold inward. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was love. Or maybe it was the understanding that grief, when left unexamined, can turn into bitterness, and I had seen what bitterness did to people. I began reaching out again, not to everyone, just to the ones who mattered. Marcus came by some weekends to help me with small repairs Daniel used to handle. We talked about him without whispering, without tiptoeing around his name like it might break something. We laughed sometimes, guiltily at first, then freely. I reconnected with cousins I hadn't seen in years, attended birthdays I'd once declined out of habit, said yes when my neighbor asked if I wanted to walk with her in the evenings. Each small step stitched something back together. The garden grew faster than I expected. The tomato vines tangled themselves along the fence, unruly and stubborn. One afternoon, as I tied them back, I thought of Daniel's voice in my head. "You're doing it wrong, Mom." I smiled through the tears. That winter, I made a decision I'd been putting off. I wrote Lena a letter. Not to accuse, not to demand, but to release. I told her I knew she loved Daniel, that I understood fear can make people act in ways they don't recognize later. I told her I forgave her, not because she asked, but because holding on to anger felt like letting her stay in my life longer than she deserved. I didn't include a return address. I didn't need a response. The real response came from within. I began volunteering at the hospital where Daniel had died, not in the cardiac unit, but in the family waiting area. I poured coffee, listened, sat with strangers in the rawest moments of their lives and said, "I know this hurts." And I did. One afternoon, a young woman squeezed my hand and said, "You make this feel less unbearable." I drove home that day with a lump in my throat, understanding something I hadn't before. Loss had given me a voice I never wanted, but one that could help others survive. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, I visited the cemetery alone. I brought fresh flowers and a small stone I'd picked up from the beach years ago, the same one we'd laughed about because it looked like a heart if you squinted. I sat on the cold ground and talked to him like he was still listening. I learned something about letting go without letting myself disappear. The wind rustled the trees, the world kept breathing, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was being left behind. I felt like I was moving forward, slowly, carefully, but with purpose. People often ask me how I survived it. Not just my son's death, but the way it happened, the way grief came tangled with betrayal, silence, and a truth that almost didn't make it to the surface. They expect an answer that sounds strong, something polished, something inspirational. But the honest answer is this: I survived it slowly. Some days survival looked like getting out of bed and opening the curtains, even when the light hurt my eyes. Other days it looked like staying in my robe until noon and letting the world wait for me. Healing, I learned, doesn't move in straight lines. It circles, it pauses, it doubles back when you least expect it. For a long time after Daniel died, I carried a quiet fear with me. Fear that if I stopped telling the truth, even just to myself, I would lose him all over again, that he would become whatever story was most convenient for someone else to tell. That fear is what kept me honest. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to punish. I didn't need revenge dressed up as justice. I needed dignity. And dignity, I discovered, comes from standing firmly in what you know to be true, even when your voice trembles. There are still moments that catch me off guard. A man Daniel's age laughing in the grocery store aisle, a song he loved playing unexpectedly on the radio, the smell of rain on warm pavement, the same smell that filled the air the night he taught me how to jumpstart my car. Grief doesn't ask permission before it enters the room, but neither does love. And love, unlike grief, doesn't demand that you shrink. I think often about Lena, not with anger anymore, but with understanding that came too late to change the past. She loved my son fiercely, possessively, and fear convinced her that love was something that could be taken away instead of something that could expand. I don't excuse what she did, but I no longer carry it, because carrying it would mean letting it shape the rest of my life. And my son didn't raise me to live small or bitter. He raised me to live honest. If there is one lesson I hold close now, it's this. No one gets to decide your place in someone else's life if you showed up with love. Not a spouse, not a sibling, not even grief itself. If you loved well, you belonged. I belonged to my son's life, and I belonged to his story. So do you, in your own way, belong to the people you've loved, even if circumstances tried to push you out, even if someone else rewrote the narrative, even if you were told directly or quietly that your presence was inconvenient. Let me tell you something I wish someone had told me sooner. You are allowed to take up space in your own truth. You are allowed to grieve loudly or softly, publicly or alone. You are allowed to ask questions, you are allowed to seek answers, and you are allowed to walk away from versions of the story that erase you. On the nights when the house feels too still, I sit by the window and talk to Daniel in my head. I tell him about the garden, about the pie that finally turned out right, about the strangers who needed comfort and found it in shared silence. I like to think he knows. And if there's one thing I know for certain now, it's this. Love does not end at a funeral. Truth does not die with a body. And healing does not mean forgetting. It means carrying what matters without letting it crush you. If you're listening to this and your heart feels heavy, if you've been pushed aside, silenced, or made to feel like your love was a problem, I want you to pause for a moment. Ask yourself gently, what part of my truth have I been afraid to stand in? And then, when you're ready, take one small step toward it. You don't have to run, you don't have to fight, you just have to stay. Thank you for sitting with my story. Thank you for holding space for a mother who refused to disappear. If you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet or would you have told the truth? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about family, loss, and quiet strength, consider supporting this channel by subscribing. You're not alone here. Life did not stop after the story ended. That was something I learned slowly, almost reluctantly. When the final flowers wilted and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, there was still laundry to fold, bills to pay, mornings that demanded I decide what kind of day I would allow myself to have. Grief likes to convince you that everything meaningful happened in the past, that whatever comes next is just a pale imitation of living. But grief is a liar. What came next for me wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was made of small, almost invisible moments that stitched themselves together into something sturdy. One afternoon, months after the funeral, I received an email from a woman I didn't recognize. She said she'd attended Daniel's service, that she'd heard me speak. "I didn't know your son," she wrote, "but I knew that kind of love, and I needed to hear that it mattered." I sat at my desk and read her words twice, then a third time. After that email came another and another. Different people, different stories. Mothers, fathers, adult children who had been pushed to the edges of families they helped build. People who had been told, explicitly or gently, that their presence complicated things. They weren't asking me to fix anything, they just wanted someone to acknowledge that it hurt. I answered every message, sometimes with a paragraph, sometimes with just a sentence. "You're not wrong for loving." That became my quiet ritual. On Sunday mornings, I began baking again, not because I had anywhere to be, but because the act itself grounded me, the sound of the mixer, the smell of butter and sugar warming together.
I gave loaves to neighbors, left muffins on porches, watched hands accept them with surprise and gratitude. Giving felt different now. It wasn't about filling a space Daniel left behind. It was about letting what he gave me move forward through my hands. I kept one box in the hall closet labeled simply Daniel. Inside were the things that carried weight but not pain. Ticket stubs, old birthday cards, a cracked mug he loved because it was perfectly broken. I didn't open the box often. I didn't need to. Knowing it was there was enough. Once, while reorganizing the closet, I found the navy dress I'd worn to his funeral. I held it up and studied it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back on the shelf. Some things are meant to be kept, not reused. I ran into Lena once unexpectedly. It was at a grocery store halfway across town, in an aisle lined with cereal boxes and artificial cheer. She looked thinner, older, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy bag for too long. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she nodded. Not an apology, not forgiveness, acknowledgement. I nodded back, and that was it. No words were needed. Whatever had lived between us had already run its course. We walked away in opposite directions, two women shaped by the same man, each carrying different lessons from loving him. I didn't cry afterward. I felt finished. At home that evening, I sat at the kitchen table as the sky darkened outside the window. The maple tree rustled, its leaves thick and full now. I thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. I was still a mother. Not in the way people usually mean it, not in the way that gets recognized with phone calls or holiday plans, but in the way that shapes how you move through the world, in the way you notice when someone needs comfort, in the way you instinctively offer warmth. Motherhood doesn't end when a child does. It just changes form. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine Daniel listening to all of this, to the emails, the baking, the quiet good I try to leave behind wherever I can. I imagine him smiling in that lopsided way of his and saying, "You're doing okay, Mom." And maybe that's just my mind protecting my heart. Or maybe love really does leave an echo. If there's one final thing I want to say, one thing I hope lingers after my voice fades, it's this. Your story does not belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who lived it. If someone tries to write you out, you don't have to fight them with noise or cruelty. You can fight them with consistency, with truth, with a life that continues honestly even when it's painful. That kind of resistance is quiet, but it lasts. I still sit by the window some evenings, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I still talk to my son in the spaces between breaths. I still miss him in ways that surprise me. But I also live, fully, deliberately, because love asked me to. And because staying truthful, staying human, staying open, turned out to be the bravest thing I've ever done. There are seasons now where Daniel's absence feels like a background ache instead of an open wound. It's there when I wake up and there when I go to sleep, but it no longer dictates the shape of my day. I've learned to carry it the way you carry a scar, aware of it, respectful of it, but not afraid. On the first spring after his death, I hosted a small gathering in my backyard. Nothing formal, just a few folding chairs, lemonade in mismatched glasses, and the sound of birds making their evening arguments in the trees. Marcus came, Mrs. Klein from next door, two women from the support group, a young nurse from the hospital waiting room who'd once sat with me long after her shift ended because neither of us was ready to go home. We talked about ordinary things, weather, tomatoes, how fast time seems to move when you're not watching it. At one point, someone asked me what Daniel was like as a child. I told them about his hands, how they were always busy, always building or fixing or steadying something that wobbled, how he used to place his palm against my back in crowded places just to make sure I was still there.
When I finished, there was a quiet that felt full, not empty. "That sounds like a good man," the nurse said. "He was," I replied, and for the first time the words didn't buckle under the weight of what he'd become to others. They stood on their own. I started keeping a notebook by the bed after that. Not a journal exactly, more like a place to put the thoughts that came uninvited, snippets of memory, lines I didn't want to lose, questions I no longer needed answered. One night I wrote, "Love isn't proven by proximity, it's proven by presence." I didn't know where the sentence came from, I just knew it was true. Another night, "Silence is not peace if it costs you your voice." That one took longer to write. Over time, people began asking me for advice, not because I had answers, but because I lived something they were afraid of living. I never told them what to do, I just listened and said the things I wished I'd heard when I was standing in my kitchen staring at a phone that wouldn't ring. Trust what you know. Say it calmly. Don't disappear. Sometimes that was enough. On the second anniversary of Daniel's death, I did something unexpected. I traveled. Just a short trip, 3 hours by car to the coast, the same stretch of shoreline where we'd once spent a cold afternoon collecting shells and laughing at how unprepared we were for the wind. I stayed in a small inn that smelled like salt and old wood. I walked the beach alone at dawn, shoes in my hand, the sand cool and firm beneath my feet. I talked to him there too, not with sadness this time, with gratitude. "Thank you," I said out loud, not caring who heard me, "for the way you loved, for what you taught me." The waves answered in their own language. When I returned home, something in me felt settled, not finished, but anchored. I framed one of Daniel's old photos and placed it on the bookshelf in the living room, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. Life before, life after, both real, both mine. I thought briefly about what might have happened if I had stayed quiet, if I had accepted the story I was given and folded myself into it, if I had let my grief convince me that speaking up would only make things worse. I know how that version of me would have lived. Smaller, quieter, always wondering. Instead, I chose truth. Not the kind that burns bridges or demands apologies, but the kind that steadies you when the ground shifts, the kind that lets you look back without flinching. I don't pretend the path I took was easy. It wasn't. It asked me to be brave when I wanted to be invisible. It asked me to stand when sitting down felt safer. But it also gave me something precious. It gave me myself back. There are still days when I miss Daniel so sharply it surprises me, when I hear his laugh in a stranger's voice or reach for my phone before remembering there's no one to call. Those days, I let the feeling pass through me without resistance. I don't push it away. I honor it. Because grief is not the opposite of love. It is love looking for somewhere to go. And now it has somewhere. It goes into the garden, into the waiting room, into the quiet conversations where people admit the truths they've been carrying alone, into the steady refusal to let anyone else decide the worth of my love. I live with that refusal every day, gently, firmly. And that, I think, is the legacy my son left me. Not the circumstances of his death, not the conflict that followed, but the understanding that staying true to yourself is a form of love that outlives even the deepest loss. I keep going, one honest day at a time.